The other question is how the use of offshore structures and centers is like structural to the global economy. So there is not just a little portion of the company using that, but it's actually the core. It's actually the heart of the global economy.
It isn't the heart of the global economy. The way you have to think about offshore and structure is this. A big corporation has how it actually works. And how it works is there's a corporate headquarters in London, in New York, in Zurich, in Milan, wherever. The managers are there, they issue orders. Whoever is working in a plant or a store or whatever they have around the world takes orders from the people who are doing business in London, New York, Paris, Milan, wherever. Uh, that's how the companies run. If you walk into Citibank, let's say, anywhere in the world, and you ask who's in charge here, the answer is going to be we report to New York. And the people who are running the branches report to New York. But if you now are a cop or a regulator or a tax authority, oh, that's our French subsidiary. You can't see those records without a formal request to the government, blah, 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 blah. And pretty soon you're in the maze of corporate structure. If you were to look at the structure of the big finance companies, they are like 1,000 pieces flying in close formation. If you were to look at how they're managed, those 1,000 pieces are welded together.
We don't know exactly the details of
Mm-hmm.
them, but the public knows somehow that politicians have bank
Mm-hmm.
accounts in the Caymans, for example, for instance, or like that major multinationals use Switzerland, Ireland, and
Mm-hmm.
so on, because it happens quite often. More recently, of course, that this kind of information is like in the media.
Right.
So, do you think that's like it's something that is like accessible in a way that
The
people know?
public begins to understand there's a problem. And the problem is that these big corporate structures, when it comes to the ability of government to control what they do, or to punish them if they do something wrong, or to collect tax from them, are unable to be touched because they're not there. So if I need to go chase a corporation for something it did wrong, I find out its headquarters on paper are in Switzerland or they're in the Cayman Islands or somewhere else. And now the ability of government to actually tell them what to do gets more complicated. The public is becoming increasingly aware that politicians and governments have lost control of what the corporate world does. So if the corporate world wants to go do something that's wrong, they can do it and not take responsibility by creating complex structures that put them out of reach. Intellectual property is wherever you want it to be. If somebody patents a drug or does something, with an invention, before the invention is made commercial, typically what they do is transfer it to a company in an offshore jurisdiction and tell the tax authority wherever they're operating, look, we have this patent, but it wasn't worth anything because we hadn't commercialized it yet. So it went for very little money to this offshore subsidiary. Now, when they start commercializing and there's a lot of money at hand, the money all flows to offshore. And because of our system, money isn't taxed, offshore money isn't taxed until it's repatriated. And it can be years and years and years, and it can be moved around, so maybe it's never repatriated. Because of this system of allowing intellectual property to go offshore, huge industries don't pay any tax anywhere. And that's drug companies, companies that do software, companies that do music, publishers, all kinds of people are doing this same thing to avoid paying tax anywhere. There are a couple of areas where offshore has become very important for avoiding liability, hiding ownership, hiding responsibility. Who's really in charge, who deals with what. So, for example, some insurance companies have set up so that they have a subsidiary in the United States, and all that subsidiary does is write the policy. Then when it comes time to actually settle a claim, they have a separate company, maybe incorporated offshore, that does the claims work. And then they have yet another company that might do valuation or something else. So now, if you're dissatisfied, you want to sue somebody, the question is finding who has the records, where they are, and who's responsible. Now, within the company, you can go and see very clear lines of responsibility. They all know. But when you go to actually take legal action, they say, well, that's our Cayman Islands subsidiary, that's our Bermuda subsidiary, and you'll have to go interview those people separately, and those corporate records are kept somewhere else. So you find yourself in a world where you can't get at the records and you can't figure out who's responsible. We just had the situation where an American company, the largest U.S. bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, lost somewhere between $2 and $9 billion. Now, the stunning thing is that those losses were done in London by the main treasury operation in the bank. Now, why would you put the main treasury operation of the biggest bank in the United States in London? And the answer is because the cops can't look at it. The regulators can't see it. The U.S. government isn't there to control it. And the only reason we found out about it was they lost their shirts. They're a bunch of idiots. The problem at bottom is if they lose their shirts by enough, they're going to come back to the government and say, help us, we're sinking, and you can't afford to let us go down.
Since I am focusing on Cayman, maybe you can tell me how it's central to the entire global economy, and then I feel that it's particularly connected to the U.S.
Cayman is an easy flight from Miami. It's, about less than an hour, and there are flights all day, every day. You can fly in, fly out, no problem. And the lawyers who work in Cayman can fly to the U.S., fly out, no problem. Before Cayman was important, the country of importance was the Bahamas. And the bankers and all the people who used the Bahamas kind of went crazy when they figured the Bahamas are going to become independent. And the man running the country was going to be a black prime minister. And they didn't trust him. So all of them looked around for another place nearby that would not be independent, that would be a crown dependency, and they picked Cayman, which was nothing more than a sandbar and a mangrove swamp and a lot of mosquitoes. Delaware has set up an arrangement where its LLCs, limited liability companies, are completely anonymous, and you cannot find out who's behind them. There are no records in Delaware, no required financial filings, nothing. And maybe in a difficult circumstance, there could be a subpoena to the service provider to find out whose credit card paid for the company, but even that won't necessarily tell you anything because it could have come from anywhere in the world.
You say Delaware is used because it's anonymous, and then it's also like much easier to open a company there, right?
Well, it's pretty easy to open a company in a lot of places. There are services that will set up companies for you pretty much anywhere you want. But Delaware just requires so much less information. Now, Delaware has other qualities as well, and some of those are legitimate. So, for example, it has a law which is very favorable to company management. So big corporations love to set up in Delaware because they know their managers will be protected from lawsuits by shareholders, from other kinds of litigation, which they might be subjected to in other states. And Delaware is just a favored place for big corporations because of that ability of the law there to protect them. The judges in the Delaware Chancery Court who decide things like hostile merger situations are very experienced, and they tend to protect incumbent management. So this is something that attracts big corporations to set up business in Delaware.
In Delaware, there are all the biggest multinational, American
Right.
multinational like Coca-Cola and so on.
But that's not the problem. That's not the big problem that Delaware presents. The problem Delaware presents are these hundreds of thousands of limited liability companies that nobody can get behind and nobody can figure out. We don't much care if General Motors is incorporated in Delaware. We do care if some crooks from Serbia decide that this is a good place to set up a corporation so that they can run money they've obtained through smuggling through that to get into a bank account somewhere.
Right.
That's a big problem.
Okay, it's just one part of the problem for me. But what I wonder is like how it's possible that a state just a few miles from Washington reached that point. So the question after this is if like something that is planned. You
Well,
think that is like that
look,
just happened somehow,
yeah.
like, or like
Look, this is very difficult for Europeans, but we have a very complicated federal system. Europe may begin to figure this out if it ever wants to solve the problem of the European Union and the euro. But in our system, all incorporation law, virtually, is state. So each state decides what the laws governing its own corporations will be. Delaware, early on in the corporate field, made its laws very favorable to attract the business of incorporation. Now, corporations typically incorporated in one state have the power to do business anywhere in the country. They simply register. Some of them are forced to set up someone as an agent in the other state, but it is a matter of state law. So when there's litigation, when somebody, say, wants to sue the board of directors, when somebody wants to have a merger and they want to take over the company, this is all governed by the law of that state. Now, Delaware was actually, they call it the first state. It was one of the original states that made up the United States. And it went into this business a long time ago, back at the turn of the 19th century, and it's been at it ever since. It set very low standards, which forced all kinds of other states to lower their standards. It is a competitor for incorporation business. It charges good-sized fees to these corporations, and the fees carry about a third of the state budget. So Delaware is unique in the United States in not having a sales tax, and I don't believe it has an income tax either. And if you were to talk to a Delaware politician and say, look, you've got to clean up this corporate business, they'd laugh because they're saying, but look, this is why our people don't have to pay any tax. Well, the answer ought to be, well, the rest of us are paying a lot of tax money, so maybe you should clean up your act so we don't have to pay as much. Delaware doesn't get the capital in Delaware. All it has is the corporate structure. It's just in a way like the Cayman Islands. You go to the Cayman Islands, and despite thousands and thousands of corporations on the books, you don't see money in the Cayman Islands. The money is booked in the Cayman Islands. The paper says it's owned by the Cayman Islands, but all the money and the action is somewhere else.
You don't think that it's actually a political project,
No,
offshore?
no. That is not. I think it's more the UK havens are much more in that category.
No.
But the U.S., no, that's not as much.
That's
anonymity, that's protection from litigation, it's that kind of thing, not so much an idea that we're going to attract capital and we're going to do other things. Yeah. No.
At the same time, there aren't regulations that ban like companies registered in these offshore centers that we already know. So that could be just a law that
the answer there is to my way of thinking, there's no reason why we should respect the incorporation of corporations in places where there's no governance and no real physical presence. It's ridiculous. Why should I believe for a minute that a corporation that is simply a brass plate on the wall on some island has real existence when it does business in the United States? I want to know who the people are, and I want somebody to hold responsible when that corporation does something illegal, wrong, or when the need comes to pay tax.
I usually try to ask a question that is more positive, so it's not just negative,
right,
like critiques of what's going on now. It's like a proposition of like the future, and unfortunately, I would say I asked John how he envisions like global transparency in the world. That there is
right,
not like the possibility for someone to hide something's work. This kind of good question because actually it's something that we need and probably is also needed for the market. What I actually think is also that not just enough transparency, but seems that we need like not a global law, but something that everyone, the accountability of companies and persons
right,
is the same everywhere. That is like lacking right now. Right. So maybe if you can address this type of issue and how you think that we should be in 20 years.
Ideally, the situation would be that if a country isn't completely transparent, doesn't maintain a register with who the real people behind the corporation are, doesn't exchange information automatically, it probably shouldn't be recognized and shouldn't be allowed to do business anywhere else. And that's a really simple way to get around all of these problems. The second thing is, I think that many of these big corporations should not be allowed to have thousands of subsidiaries. I think that if you have a corporation and you have limited liability, one corporation, let those directors be responsible for everything the corporation does. Don't tell me that there's some subsidiary in the Marshall Islands that owns the vessel that blew up in the Gulf of Mexico, and hey, it's their problem, not ours. Don't tell me that when I come to do an insurance claim against an insurance company, hey, that happened with our subsidiary in Bermuda, and you'll have to file a lawsuit there to get access to the information about who processed your claim. To me, that's an absurdity. If the company does business, let it be a company, and let the people who run it be responsible up and down the line.
Yeah, I think that actually is true. I mean, the solutions are kind of simple in the end.
The solutions are very simple.
Yeah.
The problem is no one wants them. In theory, all of these corporations are supposed to have their own boards of directors. And many of them have boards of directors that are assembled from the jurisdiction that they're incorporated in. And those are guys who work for something called corporate service companies. Now, a corporate service company might have people who are sitting on as many as 800 separate boards of directors. There's no way that those guys who are nominally directors have any idea of what the corporation is doing. And that's by design. How can you possibly have a director who sits on the board of 600 companies? How can that director have any idea of what's going on? Now, the whole idea of having a director and a board is to have people who have responsibility for what the corporation does. And in fact, the corporation is in another country being run by other people, and the people who supposedly are responsible, the board of directors, knows nothing about what's going on. I was at a recent conference in Miami, and they were talking about offshore hedge funds and who's responsible. Well, the first thing that happens when you set up an offshore hedge fund is the corporate service provider, that is, the person who sets up the offshore structure, assigns directors, and now they have a deal with the lawyers, and everybody writes a contract so that nobody has any liability if anything goes wrong. So they protect themselves, and now we get to the next morning when the actual managers of the fund, who took money from customers in the UK or in Italy or in the US, disappear with the money. The directors say, we didn't know anything about that, which is perfectly true. And who do you hold responsible? The directors have had a contract that says, we're directors, but we don't take any responsibility for what the corporation does. And the lawyers have a contract that says, we're doing the legal work, but we don't take any responsibility. But meanwhile, who takes responsibility and where do you go? Transocean is a large offshore drilling company. In 1998-99, they did what was called a corporate inversion. It used to be a U.S. company, but then they got into the idea of tax planning, and they decided the best thing to do was become a Cayman Islands company. And they had a very clever group of accountants and lawyers working for them who said, look, what you're going to do is register all of your drilling rigs as ships and jurisdictions that offer flags of convenience, as we call them, and you're going to have them get the income for doing the drilling and make payments to the, quote, parent company in the Cayman Islands. But meanwhile, all of the actual corporate activity is going on inside the United States, but that is all expense. They're not getting any income in the U.S., so all they get in the U.S. are losses. But now comes the liability question, and if you'll recall, Transocean had a rig in the Gulf of Mexico that blew up. That rig turned out to be a ship registered in the Marshall Islands, and shortly after the rig blew up, Transocean went into court in Texas to say it's a ship under maritime law, and it's registered in the Marshall Islands, and we have a right to have our liability in this situation limited to the value of the ship. And they got an immediate court order limiting their liability in this case. Now, whether that'll stand up, I don't know. But I can tell you they certainly had that in mind when they did all of their offshoring of where the boats were registered, where the rigs were registered, where the companies were set up. So this is liability, it's an issue of concealment, it's an issue of tax, and these companies are using it.